Welcome back everyone, Jake here. In this video, we're going to ask the very serious question, will Russia use nuclear weapons? Rightfully so, there are many people in the world right now very concerned about this possibility. And before I give you my opinion, let me tell you a little bit about my background. And I did serve for 6 years as a nuclear and missile operations officer in the United States Air Force. I separated in February, so everything I'm going to say in this video is my personal opinion as a YouTuber and not as a representative of any government or military. So here's the question. Will Russia use nuclear weapons? And I want to first emphasize to you that Russia wants you to believe that this is a possibility. Russia sees it to their benefit that everyone in the world is fearful that Russia might use nuclear weapons. And this narrative is being driven by the Kremlin. So here's an article from RT News dated on February 28th. Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th, and within 3 days they took the conflict to an 11. Russia confirms putting nuclear forces on high combat alert. Now this special limited military operation was only supposed to last 7 to 10 days. The government in Kyiv was supposed to collapse, a puppet government was supposed to be installed, and then Moscow would have had control over the entire country again. But that's not what happened, and Russia right away used its nuclear deterrent, hoping that NATO and Western countries would not help Ukraine. So the question that we really need to ask, what does Russia gain from using nuclear weapons? And spoilers up front, I don't think they would gain anything, but this is what Russia wants. Russia wants Ukraine to surrender or give concessions or, give in to whatever Russia's lists of demands are. Russia also wants the West to halt all economic and especially military aid to Ukraine. So here's the map of Eastern Europe, and this is a serious question I'm asking you. Where do you nuke to get what you want? Russia wants Ukraine to surrender. Russia wants the West to stop helping Ukraine. So do you nuke Kharkiv? Do you nuke Kyiv? Do you nuke Warsaw? Do you nuke Helsinki? Everyone talks about the possibility of a nuclear weapon being used, but I don't think there are any targets that will help Russia get what they want. So here's the first one. If Russia were to use a strategic or tactical nuke on the battlefield, would Ukraine then surrender? Would the Ukrainians then say, oh no, Russia is using nuclear weapons, we better just surrender, we'll have the government in Kyiv go into exile, Russian tanks can come in and take the capital. The country now belongs to Russia again. And this is, a farce. The Ukrainians would never agree to this. If anything, their ability to resist and their determination to win this war would only increase. Because the Ukrainian people for centuries have suffered under Russian rule and Russian occupation, Stalin killed millions of Ukrainians in the 1920s and 30s. The Ukrainian people know what awaits them if they lose this war. If Russia somehow manages to take control of the capital and the entire country, it wouldn't be a good outcome for the average Ukrainian citizen. So now the other question, would the West stop helping Ukraine if Russia used any kind of nuclear weapon? Spoilers, no. And this is why. If using a nuclear weapon gets you what you want, then everyone will want to use nuclear weapons. So here is North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un and Chinese Communist Chairman for life, President Xi. And if Russia can go on the offensive, if Russia can attack a neighbor to expand their own empire's borders and use nuclear weapons to do it, then if that's the historical precedent, that it's to your benefit, then maybe North Korea might want to use nuclear weapons to reunify the Korean Peninsula. Maybe China will want to use nuclear weapons to retake Taiwan and exert dominance over the South China Sea. So for that reason, NATO cannot allow, historically, they cannot allow this to happen. Russia cannot use a nuclear weapon in an offensive war and be rewarded with inaction. That would set a very dangerous precedent to the world. And it's also important to emphasize that nobody is threatening the Russian state at this time. According to Russia's own nuclear doctrine of when is it acceptable to deploy and use a nuclear weapon, it's only if the sovereign territory of Russia is at threat, if the government in Moscow is at threat. And this war can end at any time if Russia just leaves Ukraine. If Russia just retreats back to its UN-recognized borders, the conflict is over, the war is over. This is within Russia's power at any time. So let's do a quick refresher of the nuclear powers in the world. There are the original 5 that achieved nuclear status prior to the passage of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. That would be the United States, UK, France, and then Russia and China. They're the 5 permanent Security Council members. There's then the states that acquired nuclear weapons in violation of the NPT. This would be Pakistan, India, North Korea, and Israel. There's then a couple NATO ally countries that host nuclear weapons, but the control still belongs to either UK, France, or the United States. And if Russia were to use a single nuclear weapon on the battlefield, NATO would not respond with nuclear weapons. 1, they don't want it to escalate, but 2, they don't need to. NATO already has enough conventional weapons and forces to easily defeat Russia without ever using a nuclear weapon in response. So I've already explained to you that I don't think Russia would actually gain anything from using a nuclear weapon. But what can Russia lose? What does Russia lose from using a nuclear weapon? And the obvious consequence is that NATO would enter the war on the side of Ukraine against Russia. Russia is already currently losing this war just to the Ukrainians, but NATO can do a lot of damage. Just off the top of my head, this is not an inclusive list, this is what I could think of that NATO could do in response to Russia using a nuclear weapon. The first one is a blockade of all Russian sea and airports. Commercially, nothing will get in or out by sea or air in response to Russia using a nuke. Unlimited cyber warfare. Up until this point, I think privateers in the West have been conducting cyber attacks, but not officially, for example, the United States military. But if Russia crossed that red line, it would be unlimited open warfare. NATO could install a no-fly zone over Ukraine. This would put NATO pilots and NATO planes at risk of Russian air defenses, but at this point I think it would be war. Next could be the complete destruction of all Russian forces in the Black Sea. Within a day, every ship in the Russian Black Sea Fleet would be targeted and sunk. They wouldn't last very long. Complete destruction of all Russian forces in the Baltic Sea. Complete destruction of all Russian forces in Kaliningrad. Complete destruction of all Russian forces in the occupied territory in Moldova. This is this weird Transnistria region, and there are Russian forces stationed there. Complete destruction of all Russian forces in the occupied parts of Georgia. Russia invaded Georgia in 2008, and they're still occupying part of their territory. Complete destruction of all Russian forces still remaining in Syria. They have a nice naval base there in the Mediterranean that wouldn't last very long. Complete destruction of all Russian forces in Ukraine. And I don't even think NATO would have to put boots on the ground. It would just be cruise missiles and jets and planes launching longer-range precision munitions against troop concentrations of Russian forces still on Ukrainian soil. And then finally, the gloves could come off and Ukraine could just be given everything. Up until this point, NATO has been resisting giving the Ukrainians Abrams tanks, F-16s, ATACMS missiles, but if Russia crosses that red line, it's all going to Ukraine as fast as possible. So what does Russia lose from using nukes? And Russia would then be fighting NATO. NATO said this is the red line you cannot cross. Using nuclear weapons on the European continent is a threat to all European and therefore NATO members. So NATO would get involved. Okay, what else would go wrong for Russia? And I actually believe the biggest deterrent to Vladimir Putin and Russia is that Russia still needs economically China and India's help. Specifically, they need them to keep buying their energy exports to fund their entire country, fund this war. Here's an article from Politico from last month. China's Xi warns Putin not to use nuclear arms in Ukraine. So the Chinese publicly are telling the Russians, don't use nuclear weapons. You might lose our neutrality at that point if you do that. Here's an article from the Moscow Times from this week. Russia turns to India for help as Western sanctions bite. And Russia has already gone to the Chinese asking for help, asking for critical components for automobiles, airplanes, and locomotives. And the Chinese have already told them no, they've turned them down. So Russia is now courting India, and it's up to India whether they want to risk sanctions being placed on Indian companies or Indian businessmen in response to going around European and Western sanctions to help the Russians. I don't think India is going to risk this, risk ruining their business relations with Europe and North America to help Russia when they're already losing. And big picture, big history, geopolitics. Here's one of my favorite maps of all time. This is from Time magazine in 1950, and it's titled Two Worlds. The first world is the NATO alliance and Western allies, mostly being democratic capitalist countries. The second world, which doesn't exist anymore, is the USSR and their Warsaw Pact allies, as well as other communist countries. The third world was everyone else, people not directly aligned with either the Western Alliance or the USSR. And there are many people that want to return to this bipolar military world, where there's two great powers that can keep each other in check. There is a coherent argument against a unipolar world in which the United States is the sole military hegemon on the planet. But here's the problem that Russia has, is that Beijing and China also wants to return to a bipolar world order, but it's not going to be based in Moscow. It's not going to be based in Russia. China views itself with an economy 10 to 20 times larger than Russia, with a population 10 to 20 times larger than Russia. Russia is a declining power. The sun has set on the Russian Empire. This war in Ukraine more than likely will be their last. And what China wants is for Russia to accept its role as a junior partner in a Beijing-led alliance. What's currently happening is Russia is just turning into a larger version of North Korea. North Korea being completely dependent on China for almost everything. And I don't think Putin and the Russians have quite accepted this yet, but Beijing is currently leading, and I think Beijing is telling the Russians, you screwed up. You had one opportunity to, conduct this limited operation, seize the capital, seize the country, get control of Ukraine within 2 weeks. You failed. China right now must be furious with the Russians, having built this close military cooperation the last 20 years, and Russia has fallen flat on its face. Does Beijing want Russia using nuclear weapons in response? And Beijing doesn't want this. The Chinese don't want this. So what does Russia lose from using nuclear weapons? And China and India could participate in economic sanctions to further hasten the decline of the Russian economy. If Russia uses nukes and China and India stop buying Russian energy exports, that's game over for Russia. The government would collapse, a new government in Moscow would form, and then Beijing would just open up diplomatic relations with that new government, saying, hey, we'll start buying your energy exports again as long as you stop using nukes. Don't ever use nukes again. So we've talked about what the Russian state can lose, but what can Putin personally use if he decides to use nuclear weapons? And Putin would officially be a dead man walking. If Putin were to use nuclear weapons, I don't think foreign intelligence agencies would hesitate very long in taking him out. It is the official position of the United States not to assassinate foreign heads of state. The United States did this in the 1950s and 60s. It was wrong. In almost every case, it made the situation worse. And around the 1970s with Jimmy Carter, the CIA said, we're not going to assassinate foreign heads of state anymore. But if Russia starts using nuclear weapons out of convenience in their war of aggression, then it's open season. Whether MI6, the CIA, the French, the Israelis, or even the Chinese want to send in assets or agents to make Putin go away, there's no deterrent at that point. If the guy in charge is using nuclear weapons and you take him out, the guy who replaces him, worst case scenario, he keeps using nuclear weapons. You're not any worse off. But if somebody can replace Putin that says, hey, we want a deal, we want to negotiate, what Putin just did was wrong and we're not going to do that, some kind of stability might reassert itself. So if Putin decides to use nuclear weapons, he's going to have to pick his favorite nuclear bunker, and he's never going to be able to leave that bunker again. As soon as he does, there might be a Hellfire missile waiting for his motorcade. So he's never going to see the light of day again, let alone attend another Olympics or World Cup or G7, G8 summit. And prior to this war, Putin had a pretty good life. By some accounts, he was the wealthiest man in the world, having stolen the wealth of Russia for over 20 years. He had a girlfriend who was a former Olympic gymnast who's younger than his daughter. This is what one of his mega mansions looks like. And Putin might still be able to recover even if he loses this war in Ukraine. The people surrounding Putin in the Kremlin are spineless and are not going to rebel against him. So if Putin wants to just claim that NATO got in the way and NATO is this evil threat to Russia forever, he can retreat back to his own borders and still hold on to his girlfriend, hold on to his mega mansions, or he can accept his fate of living in a nuclear bunker for the rest of his life. The final piece of evidence that Russia will not use nuclear weapons is that Russia didn't in the last 10 months of this conflict, even after he legally, according to Russian law, annexed 4 of these territories. So about 2 months ago, Russia annexed the oblasts of Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. And he did this with only controlling 50% of Donetsk and not controlling the capital city of Zaporizhia. How do you legally annex something that you don't occupy at all? But Russia did occupy the regional capital of the city of Kherson, and according to Russian nuclear doctrine, they can use nuclear weapons to defend their own sovereign territory, according to Russia. But Kherson was liberated about a month ago. The Ukrainian forces retook this city. Prior to the war, it had close to 300,000 people, so this is a significant Russian town according to Russian law. And Russia hasn't used nuclear weapons. If they were going to use nuclear weapons to protect sovereign Russian territory, claiming that the city of Kherson is a Russian city, then why didn't they use nuclear weapons? So obviously there's a sliding scale of how Russian a certain city is. Would Russia use nuclear weapons to defend St. Petersburg and Moscow if an invading force was about to capture the city? Absolutely they would. Would they use nuclear weapons to protect Rostov-on-Don? Probably. Would they use nuclear weapons to protect Kherson or Melitopol? The answer is already no. So now we have this gray area of Crimea, and I don't even think that Putin will use nuclear weapons to try and save or hold on to the Crimean Peninsula. So here's the question. Will Russia use nuclear weapons? And I've made the argument to you that there is nothing to gain and there is everything to lose. So for that reason, I am hopeful and optimistic that Ukraine will win this war, Russia will lose, and nobody will have to use nuclear weapons. All right, that's all for this video. If you enjoyed it, give me a thumbs up. I greatly appreciate it. If you know something I don't, leave me a comment or question. I love hearing from you guys. Till the next video, take care, be safe.